What do 50,000 Cuban troops, over $4 billion in stolen blood diamond sales, and one of the coolest opening missions in Call of Duty history all have in common? If you answered one of the most unknown and bloody proxy wars of the entire Cold War, then you're right. Because today, we're discussing the Angolan Civil War! Hi, I'm Crate13, and I do things like that silly voice and wonder why YouTube hates pushing me. But let's not waste any time and get into it. 1975, Portugal has a leftist military coup that overthrows their dictatorship and installs a brand new government. One of the main things these leftists were mad about was colonialism in Africa, especially in Angola, where the natives have been fighting a decades-long independence war. And the new government? Let Angola be independent. Wow, that was easy. I'm sure the people fighting for independence were united in the fact that they wanted to build a better country for themselves and their fellow countrymen. No. Well, you couldn't be further from the truth. You see, the rebels never organized a singular governing body to oppose the Portuguese. Instead, there were three independent groups that all declared themselves the legitimate government of Angola once the Portuguese pulled out. Okay, side note before we get rolling. As for any African war, there are multiple groups that are going to have very long acronyms to describe their names. Not to mention, there are dozens of nations that were involved in this conflict, so that goes without saying I'm going to mispronounce a lot of things today. So please, correct me in the comments. Okay, but back to these groups. First in the ring, we have the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, better known as the MPLA. They were a Marxist organization trying to flip Angola to the poorer side of the Iron Curtain. And they were led by a man named Agostinho Neto, which is a fun name to say. They had the luxury of being based out of the northwestern coast of Angola, right next to the capital city, which they were able to conquer first. Being the Leninist of this group, it's no shock that the Soviets were supporting them. But also the Cubans, which is going to be a massive detail later in the story. Our next group is the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, better known as UNITA. Now, UNITA is a bit more interesting. They were led by the extremely charismatic Jonas Savimbi. Now, if you don't know who this is, you do know who he is, because he's this guy from Call of Duty Black Ops 2.
Our journey to victory has begun! Death to the MPLA!
Savimbi stood at over 6 foot tall, towering over his men, and could give command with a booming voice. He was educated in Portugal and Switzerland and used this education to become a master at guerrilla warfare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. UNITA originally started off being Maoists, funny enough, which meant China was actually funding them at the beginning of the war. So the MPLA and UNITA both had communist origins from the Soviets and the Chinese, meaning they should be natural allies, right? No! The Sino-Soviet split had just happened recently, and both powers were vying for the position as global leader of the communist bloc. But in the 70s, China was still extremely poor, as they hadn't gotten over the whole Great Leap Forward thing. So UNITA quickly became very staunchly anti-communist to gain support from the West. And they caught the eye of South Africa and the United States. They were located in the southern and eastern portions of Angola and controlled 90% of the diamond mines in Angola, which again will be a massive detail later in the story. Our last group is going to be the National Liberation Front of Angola, or the FNLA. They controlled the northeastern section of Angola and were funded by the African nation of Zaire. But we really don't care much about them because they almost immediately would merge with UNITA because they really didn't like communists. Okay, so now we know our players, but it's important to know that they hated each other almost as much as they hated the Portuguese. You see, UNITA and the MPLA were also divided on ethnic lines. Now YouTube, at this point, doesn't pay me enough to break down sub-Saharan African ethnic tensions in great detail. So you guys get the abridged version. UNITA's main population was the Ovumbundu people, which were the native population to Angola. However, sometime shortly before the events discussed in this video, the Matubu people migrated from the north, from modern-day Congo, and pushed the native Ovumbundu people south. The MPLA was comprised of mostly Matubu people. Oh, and when I said shortly before the events of this video, I actually meant 500 BC. Yes. They hated each other for something that happened 150 years before Alexander the Great was born. Okay, but that's enough backstory. Let's get to the fighting.
Bring it on!
South Africa saw the MPLA had the advantage in controlling almost all the port cities as well as 11 out of the 15 provisional capitals. So they deployed 2,000 troops north to directly help UNITA in direct military aid. And with this aid, UNITA was able to secure 5 of the 15 provisional capitals in 3 weeks. Now this is where the escalation ladder was rapidly climbing. The Soviets had sent lots of weapons and military advisors to instruct the MPLA on what to do, but no direct fighters. By this point in the Cold War, Cuba had been the Soviet Union's little brother, and wanted to play a bigger role despite Moscow not wanting to turn this into a powder keg. Well, Cuba didn't care, so they immediately deployed 18,000 troops to help the MPLA in fighting. And it worked, as the capital Luanda was completely controlled, and Cuban forces were able to repulse a South African Defense Force assault on the capital during Operation Savannah. And after this, South Africa announced that they would be withdrawing from the conflict. This would mean almost certain MPLA victory, and for Savimbi's own head's sake, he couldn't allow that. So he personally flew to Pretoria, one of South Africa's 3 capitals, and met with Prime Minister John Vorster. And I don't know what the hell Savimbi said to the Prime Minister, but he immediately agreed to keep South African troops in Angola till at least the end of the year. At this point, the Soviets forbade Cuba from further intervention, as they just wanted to contain South Africa with Angola, not draw the eye of the United States. Now, did Cuba listen? For a second time, no. They smuggled a 650-man special forces team across the globe disguised as tourists. They carried machine guns, 75mm cannons, and 82mm mortars in briefcases, and eventually ended up in Angola. Eventually, the Soviets were like, F it, it's at least working, so you guys do whatever you want to do. So Cuba sends even more men, with over 50,000 Cuban troops being sent to Angola for direct military action. But it wasn't just the Cubans. They were joined by over 2,000 East German airmen who flew combat missions directly for the MPLA using helicopters and fighter jets. Eventually, Romania got involved themselves, sending over 600 of their airmen to teach the Angolans how to fly their jets. Hell, even North Korea wanted a piece of the action, sending 3,000 of their own men to aid the MPLA in their fighting. And the North Koreans would build Nito's mausoleum after he would die later in the story. And all the while, the United States did nothing. At least for now. You see, by the mid-1970s, America was fresh out of Vietnam and a president. We had just got done fighting a communist insurgency in a jungle in a country that hardly any American could point out on a map. We were tired. But President Gerald Ford didn't want to just allow the Soviet Union to march through southern Africa. So he approved covert funding to UNITA. However, the State Department and the CIA said logistically it couldn't be done. They said the aid needed to actually make a difference in UNITA's fight would be impossible to cover up from the public. And guess what? Even the covert aid was too much. Iowa Senator Dick Clark, was able to uncover it, as well as a New York Times reporter. Senator Clark passed the Clark Amendment, which banned U.S. funding for any private military organization based in Angola, which passed with surprising bipartisan support. But now that it was explicitly illegal, the CIA did want to fund Angola. CIA Director George H.W. Bush, yes, that one, refused to concede the fact that he couldn't fund UNITA. So here's what he did. He would secretly include extra weapons to our greatest ally, Israel, who would then take them and smuggle them to South Africa, who then from there would give them to UNITA. But why Israel, I hear you asking, my astute and very curious viewer? Well, Israel was kind of in a weird spot internationally speaking, and were very isolated. South Africa was kind of in the same spot due to the whole apartheid thing. So the two became natural allies. If you didn't know, South Africa actually used to have nuclear weapons. I might make a video about what nation helped them get them. Allegedly. After that brief mention, there's a strong likelihood this video won't get pushed. So here's where I humbly ask for you to not only like, but hype this video up if available to you. And comment down below what other topics you would like for me to cover in the future. Anyways, shameless plug over. Okay, so with foreign aid and fighters pouring in from all over the world and the United States not really caring that much about UNITA, you'd think the MPLA would be doing great, right?
No!
Like most communist states, during the beginning, a few strongmen are vying for complete control over the entire system. Angola was no different. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit confusing, but bear with me. Agostinho Neto, spelled with an E, was president of Angola. His interior minister was Neto, spelled with an I, Alves. And this Neto Alves guy was quickly gaining power in the system. Alves even went to the Soviet Union and was given the green light to launch a coup. But before he could arrive, the original Neto caught wind of it and arrested him as well as 150 of his closest allies in government. After this, all was well until the 8th Brigade of the FAPLA, FAPLA, stormed the prison and freed Alves along with his followers. They took over a radio station, captured 7 pro-Neto government officials, and executed them. Eventually, Cuban troops would raid the radio station and capture or kill many of the coups. Coups? The guy who's doing the coup. Anyways, the MPLA held massive secret trials where they found the leader of the 8th Brigade, Jacobo Immortal Monster Catano, which, despite research, I could not find out how he got this nickname. Anyways, they found him guilty and executed him quietly in a shallow grave. But it didn't stop there. The MPLA launched a massive purge that killed an estimated 90,000 people. And this decimated their ranks. At the start of the war, they had 200,000 card-carrying members. By this point after the massacre, they only had 30,000 party members. And none of it ended up even mattering because Nito would die a year later and would be replaced by Jose Eduardo dos Santos. But going into the 1980s, South Africa would only increase military aid, launching Operation Pretoria, which decimated MPLA advancements into southern Angola and destroyed millions of dollars in Soviet-supplied helicopters and tanks. At this point, Cubans and South Africans were openly fighting each other in the field, and the Soviet Union was only doubling down on its investment. But a new player was about to enter the game. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1981, and the only thing he hated more than Nancy Reagan's past was communists. So Reagan supports one of the strangest meetups in all of human history in order to gain public support for funding the Angolan rebels. So Ronnie went to his friend Louis Lerman, CEO of Rite Aid, yes, the drugstore, and asked him to fund American conservative activists Jack Wheeler and Jack Abramoff to launch Democratic Internationale.
Prestige worldwide. Why?
This was like the Justice League, but for anti-communist militants. Their members included, but weren't limited to, Jonas Savimbi himself, Adolfo Calero, leader of the Contras from Nicaragua, Pau Cao Her, a Hmong Laotian resistance fighter against communists there, U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, South African Security Forces, and Abdurrahim Wardak, the Afghan leader of the Mujahideen. Absolute dream blunt rotation. Anyways, they came together in Jamba, Angola, and declared their cooperation in the liberation of all peoples oppressed under Soviet imperialism. After this, in 1985, Reagan got Congress to repeal the Clark Amendment, like it was doing anything to begin with, but cash could flow in higher quantities and a lot faster now. And with this funding, the fighting only intensified. Savimbi went on the offensive, and it was here some not great things were alleged to have happened. There are reports of massacres in MPLA-controlled villages by UNITA forces, and any surviving children being conscripted to be child soldiers. Because is it really an African civil war if the highest-ranking soldier on the field isn't a 12-year-old with an AK? So international recognition of Savimbi's forces took a credit blow here. But South Africa did not care, because in 1987, they went on an absolute tear, killing over 1,000 MPLA fighters and destroying 150 Soviet tanks, all at the expense of just losing one member of the SADF. Not to mention the logistical gold mine that was continually being captured by South Africa and given to the United States. You see, the MPLA wasn't leading the war effort. Not really. Soviet officers were making every single military decision for them, all the way down to the brigade level. So any captured military intelligence or equipment would be reflective of how the Soviets would fight an actual conventional war in real life. And this all culminated in the second largest battle in all of African history, right behind the Battle of El Alamein from the Second World War. In the city of Cuito, Cuanavale, 6,000 SADF personnel laid siege and battled not only MPLA forces, but over 12,000 Cubans. The fighting would be intense with major artillery barrages and airstrikes happening on both sides. And both sides eventually claimed victory because the fighting got so bad, they both just kind of agreed to quit and walk away from it. That's an oversimplification, but the battle itself could warrant an entire video just in and of itself, and this is already a long video. Oh, but remember how I mentioned South Africa had nukes? Well, after this battle, they tested a nuclear weapon near the border of Angola, and the Cubans understood the message. Cuba and South Africa both agreed to pull out militarily and let the Angolans duke it out themselves in 1989. During Cuba's involvement from 1975 to 1989, 500,000 Angolans would be killed directly from their intervention, as well as Cuban troops deploying nerve agent against UNITA forces, which is a big no-no under the Genevan Convention. Then, in 1989, dos Santos and Savimbi met in Zaire and agreed on a ceasefire. And it was all good until the president of Zambia released a statement. You see, Savimbi had already scheduled to go to the United States to meet with President Reagan, and the president of Zaire took that as admittance that Savimbi was going into exile there. And that's what was announced publicly by Zaire's president, even though that wasn't a part of the ceasefire. It was the equivalent of Little Carmine at the peace talks in The Sopranos.
The no-shows, the wire room, veto, put it all behind us. Yeah. Your brother Billy, whatever happened there.
All right then, whatever happened there.
So the ceasefire fell apart before it could even start. Sound familiar? Anyways, they tried again after 2 more years of fighting in 1991. The MPLA and UNITA signed the Biases Accords, which agreed that Angola would have a free and open election between Dos Santos and Savimbi for president. Dos Santos received 49% of the vote and Savimbi got 40% of the vote, in an election that independent observers said wasn't fair. Over 500,000 UNITA members were not allowed to vote, and that would have been enough people to sway the election. Now, election fraud is bad enough, but things got worse. Savimbi sent his vice president to go negotiate with the MPLA about another election. And when he arrived in Luanda, he was ambushed, drug out of his car, and shot. MPLA police and citizens armed by the same police then went door to door across the country, massacring UNITA supporters and voters, in a massacre that would claim over 10,000 lives and be known as the Halloween Massacre. After this, Savimbi launched massive campaigns all over Angola and saw his greatest success of the entire war. But in gaining this territory, they committed many of their own atrocities against MPLA-controlled cities. And because of this, President Bill Clinton would declare UNITA an enemy of U.S. foreign policy and sanction them. Fighting stalled out, and eventually Savimbi was given the role of vice president under Dos Santos in 1996. Savimbi said he just wanted peace for his country and accepted the role, and there was peace for a time. Savimbi really did try to make it work and asked his UNITA forces to stand down, but many refused. And with this, the MPLA continued their advance and ended up capturing most of the country. And after this, the coalition government completely fell apart. Savimbi would flee the capital and head to his historic base of Moxico and would prepare his final stand. Jonas Savimbi was killed on February 22, 2002. UNITA's next president would die 3 days later from diabetes on February 25, 2002. Savimbi went out in a hail of bullets, and the next guy couldn't handle the sugar. After Savimbi's death, UNITA fell apart completely, and the war was basically over. Now, by this point, the United States had cut off aid for almost 10 years. So how did they continue to fund the war that long? The answer is De Beers. De Beers ended up purchasing over $4 billion in illegal diamonds from UNITA despite global sanctions. Not only were they paying in cash, they were also paying in Eastern European military equipment. So if you got married between the years 1990 and 2002, there's a very high likelihood that your ring directly funded one of the deadliest conflicts of the Cold War after the Cold War was finished. That's kind of cool. But over 1 million people died from the Angolan Civil War, and their citizens are still dealing with the consequences to this day. 156 people have died since 2018 from landmines left from the Civil War. And all of Angola's population basically lives in cities because everyone's too scared to live out in the country because so much leftover military ordnance is still out there. It's a conflict that defined not only a region of Africa, but an entire era of 2 superpowers moving pawns around a chessboard without a care of who they knocked over. Well guys, this was a long one, so I appreciate you sticking around until the end. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe. And maybe join the channel if you want to go a step further. You get put in the Discord, which is an awesome time, and get your name featured right here with all these other beautiful people. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed whatever food you decided to eat or whatever poop you decided to poop when you sat down to watch this video. I'm Cray13, and I hope you have a blessed day.